What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about what's possibly one of my favorite films of the year, and that film is called A Complete Unknown. Directed by James Mangold, who wrote this film alongside Jay Cox, this film stars people like Timothée Chalamet, Monica Barbaro, Elle Fanning, Edward Norton, and many more. And before we get too far into this video, I'd like to say a big thanks to all of you guys for taking your time to click on this video and listen to my thoughts on A Complete Unknown. If you're new to the channel, I want to have you consider subscribing to the channel, as every week I have reliable early reviews for movies and TV shows, as well as things like retrospective reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog. But if you're a returning visitor, thanks so much for coming back. And today we're going to be talking about A Complete Unknown, coming from James Mangold and based on a book by Elijah Wald known as Dylan Goes Electric: Newport, Seeger, Dylan, and the Night That Split the 60s. This film takes us back to the 60s and shows us the rise of Bob Dylan, one of the most influential people in music. And even if you're not familiar right out of the gate with Bob Dylan, his music, he is one of the people that you've probably heard his music in movies, TV shows, and even if you haven't, he's one of the most influential people of music in the time of the 60s, with him transitioning from folk to rock music and really shaking things up. And outside of that, I've always been a sucker for a good biopic that showcases somebody in music, an artist that undeniably was incredibly talented and, had that influence in the music world, but also as somebody who was a little bit troubled, not somebody who's everybody loves. And I think that those usually make for the best stories and oftentimes make for the best artists. And in the case of Bob Dylan, he was exactly that, somebody who came in as this young, talented guy who was different. He has this very eclectic way of talking, standing. His mannerisms as a whole are very unique. And so here he comes in with this unique voice and this very different style of music, and then he comes in there and shakes everything up. And as somebody who was a big fan of music growing up, and somebody who my parents raised me on a lot of older music, Bob Dylan was definitely somebody I heard plenty of and listened to plenty when I was younger. Now, I wasn't familiar with all of his story though, so going into this, it was nice to be able to see a story play out, because outside of interviews that I had seen or different videos online that have maybe broken down parts of his life, I hadn't seen the entire story. So it was nice to go into this and kind of be told his story. And when I saw that James Mangold was one of the main writers and the director of this film, I knew that this film was in good hands, because he's just a phenomenal director. And in the last, decade of time with things like Logan or Ford v Ferrari, the guy just knows how to direct a very grounded film that's able to put characters at the center while also having exciting set pieces in the film. And I think that that's exactly what you get here with A Complete Unknown. And to start this off, you have to immediately jump into the thing that I think most people are going to be talking about when it comes down to this film, and that is Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan. This is a guy who, when I first was introduced to him, I thought, yeah, this is a good actor. Back in the day, before he had done Dune and all the things that have made him incredibly popular now, and I thought, this is a good actor, but I felt more of like a pretty boy kind of status. It felt like one of those actors who was getting incredibly popular because of how good looking he was. But man, oh man, has this guy really shocked me over the years with the big choices he's made. I love the fact that he's done things like the Dune franchise, something like this now with A Complete Unknown, some of the other indie films he's done in the mix, as well as something like Wonka, where he's able to go wacky and crazy. And whether you like that film or not, I admire the fact that he's able to take these huge swings as an actor. And I think his performance here as Bob Dylan has to be one of the best in his career, definitely a career defining performance, because he truly becomes Bob Dylan in this movie. And I think that's one of the greatest things that can happen at all in any biopic. You want to be able to see a movie and be sold that the actor you're looking at is the individual that they're playing. And there's one of two ways you can kind of come into a biopic, right? You can either be familiar with what that actor or that individual is like in terms of the person that the biopic is on. You can know what they're like, you can know their mannerisms, and so you're kind of hoping to be sold by the actor on what they look like or how they play the actor. And then there's the other side where maybe you're not familiar with who they're playing, so they kind of are able to pull you in with their interpretation in and of itself. And in the case of this one, going into it knowing who Bob Dylan is, having seen tons of interviews with him, he's got that very eclectic, interesting mannerisms and the way he talks, the way he speaks, the way he moves. I think that Timothée Chalamet did his homework 100% to capture the essence of who Bob Dylan is and fully became this guy. And majority of the film, not only around Bob Dylan, that also features other big names in the music world who are played by different actors, is all sung by the actors and actresses in the film as well. So I think Timothée Chalamet nailed it in the vocal world too, sounding exactly like Bob Dylan in so many sequences in this film. And yeah, I just wanted to start this off by giving huge kudos to Timothée Chalamet, because he is the star of this film, and it completely is deserved, to be completely honest. Outside of him, we get to learn about some of the story beats around him, most notably people like Elle Fanning, who plays Sylvie Russo, who's a love interest to Bob Dylan for a big chunk of his life. We get to see the ups and downs of their relationship, starting from when he was very small in the world of music to where he becomes this big name and starts to become a little bit stuck up. Amidst this as well, we also get to see his troubled relationship with Joan Baez, played by Monica Barbaro in this film, and we get to see how their relationship started as this really fun musical collaboration that eventually turned into something a little bit romantic at times, but ultimately had its moments where things were shaken up and their dynamic wasn't always as fun as it used to be. And I thought that the chemistry between both of these two romantic interests were really awesome, because you have two different dynamics entirely that bring these characters together. And I think that these actors as a whole did a great job of being able to play off of the romantic and the sexual chemistry, as well as being able to play off of the elements that tend to frustrate each other amidst all of that. Another great dynamic in this film as well is you have Edward Norton here playing Peter Seeger, who is a folk artist who ended up finding Bob Dylan and kind of ended up helping Bob Dylan find the rise that he did. It was Peter Seeger who was a huge part of that. And you have this really interesting dynamic where the two of them are so close, there's almost a mentor relationship there, ultimately for Bob Dylan to eventually become this big name and kind of find himself outgrowing these people who were integral and making him become the Bob Dylan that he is, especially as he starts to transition into things like the electric music, which is something that the folk community is not about. So he finds himself kind of struggling with different individuals, and we get to see some other big stars that were adjacent to this story that are attached in different ways. You have people like Johnny Cash in this film, who's played by Boyd Holbrook, and so it's really awesome to see kind of the atmosphere and the vibes at this time, the various big artists and names that were involved, how the folk community kind of took in Bob Dylan and how they kind of viewed him as he started to change. And it's also interesting to see his transition throughout the course of the film as well, because Timothée Chalamet has to play this very humble, talented, likable kid at the beginning of the movie who, finds this success, but ultimately over time finds himself becoming more and more jaded, more and more selfish, and eventually almost becomes incredibly entitled. And part of that is just so exciting for a movie like this, right? To watch this character who is both likable and dislikable in so many parts of the film, and being able to see them go through this big rise of success, but also see them push through adversity and still at the end of the day come out influential on the other side. This is one of those individuals who, whether you like him or don't like him, it's undeniable that he shook things up, and the fact that he shook things up meant that he was going to have people who hated him. And so it's interesting to see this movie where not all the characters are rooting for him, not all the characters are in his corner, but there are plenty who are. And so to see the dynamics, all these different characters that kind of were super close at one point that no longer are, and just to kind of see that storyline play out over the course of the film, I thought was really great. All of this really leads up to a big festival, the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, which is where everything really shook up. And again, I think that Timothée Chalamet and the entire cast here is incredible, because outside of them, there's so many other big names in the mix. I was just surprised consistently to see how many big names were in the mix. And outside of the cast and the characters here, James Mangold is just a phenomenal director when it comes down to filmmaking, So this film is filled with incredible looking cinematography, the lighting, the overall color palette of the film as well, and the fact that it's a period piece. You got to make it believable that it's in the 60s. So you have all the right attire, you have all the right decor in the various rooms, the vehicles, all the things you want to see and hear in a biopic that's set in the 60s to make it feel like it's set in the 60s. And James Mangold is just great at that kind of stuff when it comes to period pieces, when it comes down to a look for a film like this. It felt like it took me back in time and ultimately really grabbed me from beginning to end. I think this is a film that's really going to work for fans of biopics. I think this is going to be a film that works for people who love music. If you really enjoy a good dramatic picture as well, I think there's a great story here, because whether you're into Bob Dylan's music or not, whether you're familiar with him or not, I think this is one of those situations where you just have a really well-made film here that tells a really well put together story that is well realized. It's one of those movies that by the time you get to the end, you're like, man, they really jam-packed so much great storytelling in there in such a solid way, and it's so well made throughout the entirety of it that you just can't deny that this is a solid flick. Now, with that said, though, if you're not into folk music, there are segments in the film where we are watching Bob Dylan play music, as well as the various other individuals who are in the movie. So there is that element too. If you're not into folk music, maybe it won't capture you 100%. But as somebody who loves music, I thought that they did a great job capturing these sequences and making it exciting to watch. Some of those musical sequences in the film were awesome, and not musical in the sense that they stopped in the middle of dialogue to sing, just when they're performing on stage or when they're recording tracks for a recording album, whatever the case may be. Overall, I found A Complete Unknown to be a great time. I think this is without a doubt one of the best films to come out in 2024. I think that when I start to see stuff coming out for award consideration for this film, I will not be surprised whatsoever. I think that the cast was phenomenal. I think that James Mangold nailed it in the director's chair, and I think everybody else who was part of this production team came to play in the wardrobe department, the director of photography, whatever the case may be. I think this is certainly a film that should be on your radar, especially as we get to the end of 2024. This film will be releasing wide on Christmas Day, but I believe there will probably be some earlier screenings that start to sprinkle out in that week or so prior. But a big thanks to the kind folks that sent me an early invite to come and check this film out in the theater. I was so happy to see this in a theater early. Overall, I think A Complete Unknown is a beautifully made film that tells a really interesting and complex story about an interesting individual who shook things up in music, but ultimately was a character that was, you know, he's not everybody's cup of tea, and I love those kind of biopics. It makes for the most interesting stories. If I had to lean into any gripes though to wrap this video up, I would say my biggest gripes were there were just a couple of characters that I felt got sidelined at certain points in the film. The most notable one for me would be Elle Fanning as the character of Sylvie, the love interest that we are initially introduced to in the film. I think that there's plenty done with her in the film, so by no means do I feel like she's completely sidelined and that they do nothing with her, but there are segments of the film that once Bob Dylan kind of becomes popular and he moves on, that she's not around, and then when she pops up again, it's like, oh yeah, she's in this movie. So I would say that was probably my biggest gripe, but outside of that, I genuinely think this is one of those films that if there's a thread, it comes together by the end. There are so many characters that they have to focus on, and they really do bring it all together by the time you get to the end of it, and they create a story where even you as an artist feel conflicted on Bob Dylan. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he awesome for pushing back against the folk community and doing what he wanted to do in the world of music? I think that the film poses some interesting questions while also just being an interesting documentary of an interesting, complex individual that, again, undeniably shook up music for its time. So a big thanks to you guys for watching. Let me know, are you planning on checking out A Complete Unknown? And if you're checking this out after the movie has already come out, did you like the movie? Did you not like the movie? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.